You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello and welcome to another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. My name is Nasim Ahmed and I will be your host for today's discussion. Why has advocating for Palestine become as fraught and contested as it has? It's hard to imagine, let alone find another case where advocating for basic human rights, campaigning for equality, and to end racism being challenged in the same way as we see in the case of Palestine. Not only challenged, of course, but also smeared and threatened simply for standing up for what would normally be accepted as basic freedoms and values. This is the subject of our discussion today. It is also the theme of a new book titled Advocating for Palestine in Canada, Histories, Movements, Action, edited by Emily Regan-Wills, Jeremy Wildman, Michael Bueckert, and Nadia Abu Zahra. I'm really pleased to be joined by one of the editors, Michael, to discuss the book. Michael is the Vice President of the National Advocacy Group, Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East. Michael has a PhD in sociology, specializing in political economy from the Carleton University in Ottawa. Thank you for joining us, Michael.
Thanks so much. Really happy to be here.
Thank you. It's a real privilege to have you on the show. Let's begin with the origins of the book itself. Speak to us about the thinking around, with you and the editors around the book, why you felt the need to produce this book at this time.
Yeah, thanks so much. So this book, I actually have a copy here. That's what it looks like. But it basically is one of the products that came out of a symposium that was launched in 2019 that was organized by some of the other editors on the issue of Palestine and Canada, noticing that there's a total absence, a real lack of scholarship and work being done on these issues. And so that was sort of the first time to try to create something, bring people together who are doing, working around the edges of this into one place and to build on that and to see how people could work together going forward. And so out of this symposium that brought people together from across Canada, there were actually a number of volumes that are in the works. One's on more like international relations between Canada and Palestine and Israel. There's a issue on settler colonialism coming out. And there's already been a special issue of the Canadian Foreign Policy Journal, which actually looks at the perspectives of former diplomats who have been working in Israel and with the Palestinian Authority. So there's been sort of a bunch of ways to try to build on the work of that symposium. And the last one of these initiatives is this book, which really specializes in taking those papers and from that conference that were more focused on advocacy, on activism, and especially those that look at the challenges, some of the threats to speaking out about Palestine. And so it's quite an original collection, the first of its kind, which brings together, scholars on one hand, but also practitioners, activists, people who have been working within civil society for many years on these questions, for the first time bringing their perspectives into one volume. So hopefully this is a first step towards creating a much greater literature on this topic in Canada and more reflection and sort of I guess like what's the benefit of that? One is to self-criticize, to see sort of what we've done right, to celebrate our successes, but also to point out those things that maybe
these are some of the things
wrong.
we'll get to later on how to assess advocacy for Palestine in Canada, of course, broadly around the world as well, in mainly Western countries where there's been a lot of pushback against it. There's loads of entries and articles by Palestinians who speak about, who provide testimonies of their experience of how difficult it is been to be a Palestinian in Canada. and it's quite emotional reading some of those testimonies. One of the other things I noticed is actually the theme of the book itself. I mean, as you know, MEMO, we host an annual Palestine Book Awards. That's been happening for the last over a decade now, 13 years, I think. And every year, the number of nominations keeps going up, 50, 60, 70, endless stream of books being produced on Palestine. But more recently, I've noticed that the theme of writings on Palestine, or one theme anyway, has been is the actual difficulties and challenges people face in talking about Palestine. One example is the one which I think won one of the Palestine Book Awards last year, which is Except for Palestine: The Limits of Progressive Politics by Mark Lamont, which again, really, it's not just about Palestine, it's more really a reflection on Western society. Where are we heading as a society, as a civilization, in terms of progressive issues, progressive values, which we hold to be dear. And Palestine is just one example of that. And that genre, that theme, I think, is something you've taken on board with your book as well. So why do you think this has become such an important area of study in your view?
Well, I don't think it's because things have gotten worse. I mean, there'd be a tendency to interpret that as, well, more people are writing about the challenges, therefore there must be more of them. I think it's actually more of a sign almost of success or of progress, in the sense that years ago, 10 years ago, all the books would have been about making the case for BDS, the case for Palestine. I think to an extent, more people are already there, and there's more of a need to get past sort of basic introductions and to get more into, well, people are actually doing this work, and here are all of the problems that they're facing. And so in a way, it's a sign, I hope, of progress, in the sense that there's more to self-reflect on, and it's less about sort of making the initial case to people who might be skeptical. Obviously there's a lot of work to be done, but there's significantly more awareness and support for the Palestinian movement now than there was 10 years ago, I think. So I don't know, that's my optimistic spin on that.
No, it is. It definitely is. I think clearly, even in my own experience working on Middle Eastern issues, Palestinian issues, the signs of success are there, which is why you have such a powerful pushback against it from various corners of society. So it's not something to be sad about. It's something to be an occasion to be optimistic. That's how I look at it as well. Returning to your book, so what do you think are the main issues when it comes to advocating for Palestine in Canada? I mean, it's just a big book. So, I mean, just the key points which you think are important for us to be aware of.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much. It's kind of hard to know where to dig in, but maybe I'll approach this by talking about some of the chapters that are in there, because they look at different issues. They're not all looking at the same content, but there's so many different areas to dig into. So, for example, we have one great chapter by Davide Mastracci, who writes about pro-Israel bias in Canadian media, and exploring that from the perspective of someone who's worked in the industry and some of the challenges he's come up against, as someone who's written about things related to Palestine, but also writes about broader issues, editorial control, and how that can often be used to push a very strong pro-Israel perspective. The problem of very aggressive pro-Israel lobby groups that seek to complain about and try to get corrections for virtually anything that is written about Palestinians in a positive way, or that criticizes Israel. And so that's a really interesting chapter at that particular problem of why, it's a problem. It's a serious problem because it means that objective reporting isn't reaching most people, that there are significant constraints to real reporting on these issues. But then there's also a problem that Diana Ralph's chapter points out. There's this really problematic idea that Jewish Canadians all support Israel unconditionally, and that politicians think that by standing up for Israel, you're actually fighting anti-Semitism. And so she actually digs into a number of different public polling of Canadian Jewish opinion and finds that there's significant disagreement within the Jewish communities, and that there's actually significant criticism and disagreement with Israeli practices, and a diversity of views on things like the BDS movement, for example. And so but this is a very common thing that you'll hear a lot of people talking about, this idea that you're standing up for the Jewish community by standing up for Israel, which is really a horrible thing to conflate those two. But also, like you mentioned, or you alluded to Naila Matuk's chapter, which is about the problem of anti-Palestinian racism in Canada and all the ways that it manifests itself throughout society in a very, it's invisible and yet so widespread. And she writes about that from personal experiences. And there's a couple of chapters here that look at campus activism, which really is one of the sites of momentum behind the Palestinian movement. Rana Nazal and Hassan Husseini talk about how the BDS movement and Israeli Apartheid Week events, which was actually founded in Canada, how those became sort of new ways to approach this issue on campus that really transformed the way the activism was happening and really gave sort of momentum and sort of a material goal or things to really pursue things like a BDS resolution, divesting from the occupation, that kind of thing. So yeah, there's so many different things that this book tries to cover. I feel like we're only scratching the surface, and yet we're hopefully brought together quite a lot of different areas that'll be useful for people to read.
There wasn't an article specifically on the really controversial definition of anti-Semitism, which is being pushed by many pro-Israeli groups, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, known as the IHRA.
Mm-hmm.
That is really at the source of many of the pushback and resistance and opposition. You've seen campuses in cities around the West. So what's the situation with that now? Is that kind of a lost battle now? Because many countries, many governments have adopted that. Is there still a challenge going on against that, and what kind of challenge is taking place in Canada with regards to the IHRA, which seems to be ubiquitously adopted by people all over the world without thinking of the impact it's having on free speech?
Right. Yeah, there is no chapter specifically on IHRA in this book. I think because this book was originally formed in 2019, when we brought together the chapters, that's the year that the Canadian government actually adopted IHRA. And since then, I think that's really when the push against it really began. And so many of the chapters look at maybe some of the ideas that are embedded within IHRA, some of the issues, but maybe doesn't directly sort of, pick apart that definition itself. But yeah, it's definitely not a lost cause. It's definitely something that there's a big movement against. Independent Jewish Voices, for example, have a No IHRA campaign. You can see it at noihra.ca, where they have been doing really good work to educate people about the problems of this definition and how it's being used to stop Palestinian activism and to silence critics of Israel, looking at the different ways that it's been used to do that. And there's actually been quite a movement at different levels, including especially there's been an academic campaign where actually I don't know if it's 30 or now even 40 campus unions have actually passed resolutions opposing the IHRA definition, as well as the National Union of Canadian Teachers and Faculty, which was a huge win, which means that that when it comes to those organizations that represent faculty and staff and students even as well on campus, they have all taken a very strong position against using these definitions to silence criticism of Israel and opposing IHRA, which puts a lot of pressure on universities, counter pressure, and may convince them, maybe it's not worth adopting sort of this controversial definition. We have had the Canadian government adopted IHRA, the provinces of Ontario and Quebec adopted it, but in all of these cases, they never adopted it through democratic means. It was always through like an executive order or some kind of just executive action on behalf of the government itself, but without putting it to Parliament to actually be debated. And I don't know if it has been successfully really gone through a democratic process to be adopted really anywhere, maybe a couple of cities, but in many cases it's been actually rejected. And so I think I actually don't think it's as strong, as much of a lost cause as it looks. I think is really important to continue to raise these concerns, even where it has been adopted, so that when administrators or officials try to use IRA to stop Palestinian activism, that every time that is attempted, that is controversial, that is fought back, that people are aware of the issues. So anyway, it is a significant problem and one of the things we're facing, but I don't think it's a lost cause.
Yeah, it's only been, as you said, 3 years, and there is pushback, and a lot of the points you've mentioned and I've raised as well, I mean, be familiar to our viewers and also recognizable to anyone who's working on Palestine solidarity and progressive issues around the world generally. But do you think in Canada specifically, anti-Palestinian racism, suppression of pro-Palestinian voice is more pronounced than, say, parts of Europe, the US? Because there is a very strong lobby in Canada, pro-Israeli lobby. Sometimes it's quite hostile, very, very hostile, as we saw last year, I think, the attack on a cafe. So do you think it's more pronounced in Canada, the issues you've mentioned, than, say, London or Paris or New York?
It's hard to say. I definitely think that sort of hostility to Palestine is sort of a really dominant perspective in Canada, at least at certain levels. I'd be hesitant to say it's sort of worse here than like Germany or France, where you see all of these stories of pretty severe repression, or in the US. But I do think that maybe it's less understood, given that Canada at least used to have sort of this reputation around the world as being sort of a middle power, or maybe someone not as bad as the US, like sort of having a bit of a better reputation when it comes to some of these issues, maybe even standing up for human rights. And I think that sort of maybe makes it harder to actually understand and to realize that Canada is probably one of the worst actors on the international stage, the most hostile to, for example, the state of Palestine being recognized in international forums, or it's one of the most hostile countries to efforts by the International Criminal Court to investigate war crimes in Palestine. It's incredibly hostile to BDS. It sees itself as being one of the strongest friends of Israel at the international level. And so I think there's a way in which Canada really is one of the worst enablers of apartheid and occupation, but people don't. Maybe that's changing, but there's at least a self-perception of Canada which just doesn't fit with that, and it makes it, I think, harder to counter. But I definitely think that Canadian policy, I don't know, Canada has been very supportive of Israel for a long time, but I do think what it looks like is kind of in waves. 20 years ago, Canada would be appearing more objective under the Harper government, starting in 2011. Well, starting in 2006, but especially after 2011, the Harper government really imposed an atmosphere of sort of fear around these issues and repression. Our foreword to the book is by Libby Davies, who was a longtime member of parliament with the New Democratic Party, who was one of the most outspoken members of parliament on these issues, and writes about how things changed, how difficult it became to have an open conversation about this, how she described it as a new McCarthyism, the type of sentiment that was imposed around these issues. So there's been a lot of change. I think what's the most disappointing thing is that with the new government of Justin Trudeau in 2015, that hasn't really changed. That the terrible atmosphere around these issues that Harper imposed has largely been maintained under the Liberal government. And
I think we'll get to that. And also, I just want to return to the points about anti-Zionist Jews and Jewish Voice for Palestine, I think, or Peace, and their contributions. And you have a number of articles in the book, and your authors certainly aren't shy in handling some of the controversial issues. And one of the controversial issues in the book is the way or the misuse of anti-Semitism and the growing phenomenon, not just in Canada, but here as well, of suppressing anti-Zionist Jews. In the UK, for example, we have scenarios where the Labour Party has expelled, Jewish anti-Zionist campaigners from the party, and it's happening all across Western capitals and cities around the world. So, how are progressive Canadian Jews combating this trend?
Yeah, as you say, some of the chapters in the book by Cheryl Nestle, Diana Rolfe, and Michael Bueckert, all of them are longtime organizers with Independent Jewish Voices, which is this anti or non-Zionist organization that I think it started around 2008, 2009, in part because the dominant sort of the mainstream Jewish institutions have also been the most dominant pro-Israel voices and advocacy organizations in Canada, leaving no space for a lot of people in the Jewish community who don't share those political views. And so IJV was formed as a response to that, and really has been, one of the leading Palestine solidarity groups in Canada. I mentioned the No IRA campaign earlier. They've done a fantastic job on that. They recently launched the Together Against Apartheid campaign, which is, pushing people to listen to the findings of those of like Amnesty International, which talks about the crimes of apartheid by Israel, and to pledge to combat that. So they're highly represented in this book because they have been, among the organizations on the forefront of this. And the issue more generally of the weaponization of anti-Semitism, I think it is addressed in almost every chapter, if not every single chapter, which I think shows just how much of a problem that is in Canada, and how that's one of pushing back against that narrative is one of the biggest challenges that we all face.
And one of those articles in there is actually yours. Commenting on a very sensitive and controversial issue, on the idea that Israel is being singled out, or singling out Israel is a form of anti-Semitism. So you challenge that by comparing, the latest attempt to suppress anti-racism voices with the way, anti-apartheid movement campaigns were suppressed in the 80s against South Africa. So talk us through these so-called 3Ds, delegitimization, double standards, and I forget the other one.
Demonization.
Demonization has been used to crack down on criticism of Israel.
Yeah, I suspect that most people have heard of the 3Ds, or at least have heard of some of its elements. Demonization, double standards, delegitimization. These are terms that were popularized into this framework called the 3Ds of anti-Semitism, really in the early 2000s, with the rise of this talk about the new anti-Semitism, this idea that pro-Israel groups were pushing that actually the real source of anti-Semitic energy is actually related to criticism of Israel. And so this framework, the 3D framework, is, theoretically, it's about clarifying what the limits of criticism are, of identifying when is criticism of Israel okay and when is it anti-Semitic. And so if criticism of Israel amounts to holding it to a double standard, or singling out Israel for special treatment, or demonizing it, that's considered anti-Semitic. And this is incredibly popular across the spectrum. You have groups like very, right-wing groups, as well as more liberal Zionist groups will use this language. Our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau even explicitly talked about the 3Ds and double standards and demonization.
Embedded within the IHRA. That definition is embedded. This idea is embedded within the IHRA.
Exactly. So this is like a nucleus, and then IHRA basically has taken this and incorporated it into itself. And so these ideas are just incredibly commonplace, used by our government, many others, incorporated within, I think, the US government as well has been adopted. So these are very popular ideas. However, it's totally bogus. I mean, what my article does is compare these standards to the complaints that were made by lobbyists for the South African government during the 70s and 80s, during intense pressures, boycott pressures, criticism at the international level, all of this activism that was happening against apartheid. South Africa made all of these same arguments. They said that the debate was really unfair and that they were being badly criticized, and you couldn't say any positive thing about South Africa. They were saying that, South Africa is being held to double standards. Well, you're not criticizing the human rights violations of China or Russia or whatever. And then there was this idea that by criticizing apartheid, they weren't actually criticizing apartheid, they're criticizing South Africa as a society. And if the anti-apartheid movement got its way, it would be a bloodbath, it would be the destruction of society. And so these were the types of complaints that South Africa would make. And it's identical to the way that people talk about criticism and protest of Israel today. In one part, this is just because these terms are entirely up to interpretation. They're entirely subjective. So what is demonizing Israel is totally up to whatever it means to the person who's saying it. There's no objective standard to compare that to. Same with double standards. When is something a double standard? They're just complaints about unfair criticism or what they perceive to be unfair. And in themselves, they don't actually prove anything. They certainly don't prove anti-Semitism. And so that's what really my article, based on archival research, really tried to get at, is that these very, very common complaints cannot be used by governments or anyone as evidence of anti-Semitism. It's just sort of boilerplate complaints that any country will use if it feels that it's being targeted by unfair criticism. So anyway, that's sort of
that's very useful. View. Yeah, that's very useful, and I think it's really, really handy. And I'm wondering if there's any research to show whether reports of anti-Semitism has gone up statistically because of the way it's been framed. If it's framed as, someone hurts my feeling by criticizing Israel, criticizing Zionism as a settler colonial movement, which is descriptively 100% accurate, but if someone is offended by that and then complains about that, then of course, surely that gets recorded and then it becomes an incidence of anti-Semitism. So I'm wondering
that is a thing that happens. That is absolutely a thing where there actually has been research done on sort of digging into some of the criteria that, for example, there's different statistics that pro-Israel groups will put together to say, this is for 2021, this many anti-Semitic incidents took place. And if you read the report, they are clearly conflating horrible instances of anti-Semitism with something like a student union passed a BDS resolution, and they compare those things as identical, and that's a serious problem, because then those numbers are being echoed by the government, by the prime minister. And it's not that there is no problem of anti-Semitism, but it is that there are these efforts to deliberately conflate that problem with just legitimate criticism and protest in support of human rights against a government that is committing the crime of apartheid. So it is a serious problem. And hopefully these chapters that dig into this can help to give people a little bit of resources to make sense of that and to push back against that.
And that topic in itself is quite big. We can talk about that for a long time. But I want to move on. You mentioned how in Canada, it doesn't matter whether the government is from the right, conservative like Harper, or centrist or leftist, if you want to call him Trudeau, support for Israel is always constant. But does that really, is that really reflected amongst Canadian society? I know you mentioned one of the contributors, writes about a survey, I think, which shows that there is more opposition amongst the Canadian population against Israel than you see in the government, for example, which is also the case, I think, throughout many other countries. So in a democracy, it's quite strange to find, such an imbalance between the public perception, the public view, and what the government and the position of the government. Is there a big disparity, do you think, between the government policy on Israel and Canadian population, the public generally?
Yeah, it's actually quite striking, the divergence between these two. I mean, as mentioned, there's been almost no change between the conservative government of Harper and the liberal government of Trudeau when it comes to policy. There have been a few things like resuming funding to UNRWA, the Agency for Refugees, a few very nominal things mostly, but the overall approaches remain the same. But if you look at public polling, there's been a number of polls commissioned over the last few years, commissioned by Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, which I work for, as well as by Independent Jewish Voices, and conducted by professional polling firms looking at Canadian opinion. And it finds consistently that overwhelmingly Canadians are supportive of, for example, opposing Israel's annexation plans, or they overwhelmingly support the ICC investigation of war crimes. They don't want to give a pass to Israel on human rights just because it's an ally or a partner in the fight against terrorism, or however you put it. People don't want to have a double standard when it comes to Israel. They don't want to give a pass when it comes to that. And even if you look at individual political parties, the Conservative Party, which is committed to following the US and move its embassy to Jerusalem, if you poll their members, over half of their members actually don't support that. And it's even more striking. I mean, the Trudeau Liberals, as I say, their policies are as if 80% of their members support Israel no matter what, but it's exactly reversed. If you look at the polling, it's a total minority within the party who want to support Israel no matter what. And it's the majority who are open to taking measures to condemn and criticize Israel's human rights violations. So I don't think that's something that can be sustained forever. It's very odd that it's been able to continue that for so long. But there's definitely a huge discrepancy. And we do see a little bit of change when it comes to some of the smaller parties or the more progressive parties, like with the Green Party of Canada a number of years ago. The membership voted in support of BDS. That that became controversial, and they ended up replacing it with a compromise motion, which didn't mention BDS, but shares a lot of the same actually tactics of BDS. So that was a whole thing. And then just last year, the New Democratic Party, their members voted in support of a motion in support of sanctions on Israel, including an arms embargo and ending trade with settlements. And to our surprise, the NDP leadership actually has been talking about those issues. And so that's a pretty bold position from the NDP, which never would have happened 5 years ago. And it's all because of this, the movement by members to try to get their political parties to actually reflect what their members actually think. And it's really slow, but definitely we have seen signs of progress of that.
And it'd be interesting. I'm looking forward to just analyzing and observing this disparity playing out, not just here in the UK, but Canada and elsewhere, of course. We see it partly in the Democrats in the US as well. But we are running out of time. So I want to ask you one final question related to a piece in the book. One of the authors does a SWOT analysis. What are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats facing advocating for Palestine in Canada, which by extension is other parts of the world as well, because the landscape is very much similar to what we see in Canada. So what are the strengths, weaknesses, and threats that we are facing?
Yeah, well, this chapter is by my colleague, Thomas Woodley, who's the president of Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East. He wrote this as sort of a reflection on his time in the organization. He's actually the co-founder of this organization about 20 years ago. And so has been thinking about this for quite a while. And I guess I won't paraphrase the whole thing, but I will point to a couple of things that he says. I mean, not just him, but a few people point out that there are quite a few communities and movements in Canada that are potentially open to supporting Palestine as a cause, that there could be connections made, whether it's Indigenous communities or Quebec nationalists who, see the fight for Palestinian independence is similar to their own struggle. There's trade unions and all sorts of communities who could be potentially won over if we take advantage of opportunities like the growing interest in ideas like intersectionality and solidarity and in the idea of anti-Palestinian racism as well, which is sort of becoming developed more and more. But he also points out weaknesses. Unlike the pro-Israel groups like mine or other institutions in support of Palestinian rights are very new. They're still developing. They haven't had decades and decades to sort of become embedded in Canadian society. And this is especially the case for there's a lot of support for Palestine among Muslim and Arab communities in Canada, which are still developing constituent-based organizations that don't have the same political power as other lobby groups in Canada have. So there's a sense that while there's certainly support at the idea level among Canadians for these policies, there aren't a lot of institutions, long-standing institutions, who've been able to really push that and effectively mobilize that to change Canadian politics. And so that's what we're working on, but it's it's quite a bit of catch-up. So that's a few of the things. He also talks about obviously the increased weaponization of anti-Semitism as a serious challenge and threat to our movement, as well as just the issue of issue fatigue, that people are tired of hearing about this and talking about this, especially if it seems that there is no progress, that nothing ever happens, it's all the same. People might kind of throw up their hands and say, I don't really want to think about this anymore. So anyway, that's just touching the surface, but hopefully there's a lot for people to dig into, to think about, to debate. As with all the chapters, hopefully it's a first sort of step towards building a better literature on this, and to reaching out there to other Canadians to raise awareness about these issues.
I thoroughly enjoyed it. I mean, do you want to hold the book up again?
It has beautiful cover art.
Yes, beautiful. So what's the cover again?
It's like a sort of a Palestinian bird figure, but it's sort of abstract and with Canadian sort of elements. But yeah, it's by Fernwood Publishing, which is a great independent.
So what can we buy from Amazon? Is it available on Amazon now? Or
I haven't checked from the UK, but it is on Amazon. In Canada, it's from Fernwood Publishing. In the US, it's from Columbia University Press. And so I think you should be able to find it.
Yeah, it shouldn't be difficult. Everyone knows how their way around the internet these days. Michael, it's been splendid having you on the show. Really pleasure talking to you. So thank you for joining us, and also viewers at home, thank you for joining us. I think we've missed you for 2 weeks, but we're back again, and hopefully see you again next week. Thank you, Michael, and thank you everyone at home.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.